This is Dan Zupansky, and you're listening to Mopping the Floor.
Hi everyone, hopefully you're here returning from my episode from last week featuring Lowry Omets of Sturgill Simpson. Speaking of Sturgill Simpson, he was nominated for Best Country Album for a Grammy and also nominated for Best Album for a Grammy. Now, we all know the Grammys are complete and utter bullshit, usually when it comes to their nominees and the people who win. But I think it's important to point out that real music is finally being recognized for something like that. So, congratulations to Sturgill and the rest of the gang. This week we have journalist and author Dan Zupansky on the podcast. Dan is the host of True Murder, which is also another podcast you can find on iTunes. I encourage anybody that loves true crime in any regard to go and subscribe to this show. It's easily the best true crime podcast on iTunes, or on the web for that matter. So join me once again in the sump room, and we'll get ready to start mopping the floor.
What's this show even about?
How are you today, Dan?
Very good, thank you.
I wanted to bring you on the program, one to talk about your book, and one to also get a sense of who Dan Zupansky is.
Okay.
So my curiosity would be, where does your interest in true crime come from?
Well, to tell you the truth, I had read very little specific true crime, although I've always been a big reader of nonfiction and books and magazines, and a big reader. However, in 2004, when I began a correspondence with Sidney Tierhughes for in the end, the book Trophy Kill, the Shall We Dance Murder, I knew immediately from looking at how you would get a book deal, the proposal you have to put together. You have to understand the market, and to understand the market you need to read the biggest authors in true crime, the biggest books in true crime history. And so I undertook to do that, and I started with a fantastic, beginning with Anne Rule, Stranger Beside Me. So immediately I was, because of the nature of the work that I needed to do to research these certain true crime classics and true crime books, the authors that were the most important authors, I also got hooked, because Stranger Beside Me about Ted Bundy and the relationship with Anne Rule, incredible. So
I've never read that book, but speaking to you, I will absolutely pick it up, because based off reading your book, I just picked up Whoever Fights Monsters,
right,
by Robert Ressler.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's fantastic so far. And speaking of Robert Ressler, actually no, we'll get to that later. What I want to ask is, in terms of you getting started in the true crime genre, it was basically on a whim, right? Like you called your friend, or your friend called you actually, and he told you who he was in the same range with.
Well, the background is that I wasn't an author, but I was on radio, doing University of Manitoba radio, doing a weekly format similar to this, but I wasn't necessarily interviewing authors per se every week. And I was interested in law enough to be chairman of media and policy affairs for a law reform group called People for Justice in Winnipeg. So I was certainly in a position of especially interest in something like this. And so that's why I always call it a fateful turn of events, that this person that I knew happened to be incarcerated on these minor charges. And I had read about, of course, everyone knew about this Sidney Tierhughes and Susan Sarandon's jewelry being found at this crime scene. And then I had read the articles about Sidney smiling and downplaying this incredible murder and what I call murder horror spectacle. So when my friend or acquaintance called me from the jail, from the correctional center, and told me, hey, guess who just walked into my jail range? It didn't take me more than, I would say, a day or two to say, geez, I should, this looks like a book opportunity. This looks like a book project that somebody, I just intuitively knew that this was going to be an incredible story.
And that it is. So let's talk about it. Trophy Kill, The Shall We Dance Murder. You spoke to your acquaintance, you found out who he was with, and what happened from there? How did you start corresponding with Sydney, sorry.
What happened is that initially I asked him, would he like to be on radio? Would he like to submit to an interview? Because that's really what I was doing at that time. And he said, yeah, at some point he would. And then I had the idea that I should write a book. And so I said, we should have a correspondence and write some letters. And he was more than eager to be involved in this, what I considered a book project, which is not so unusual. I mean, maybe in Canada it is, but as we know from the program that I do every week, that this is not such an unusual thing whatsoever. So we start corresponding, and I came to visit him. He asked if I wanted to visit him. I said sure, and I thought that would cement and support this rapport that we were going to endeavor to have. And so I went and visited him, and that was interesting. And he had said at that time something very crucial. He said, listen, I believe that when you come and visit me, those conversations are recorded. So we really can't say anything that, it would be better if we could correspond with letters, because he earnestly believed that they would not read what he would send to me. And so that was the very, very interesting beginning of our correspondence. And as a result, he started sending me things. This correspondence lasted for a year, and it was also numerous phone calls as well, about 50. But in that correspondence, after about 9 months, I asked him, listen, this is great, all this stuff that you have sent me about your family and your background and their background, and some exaggeration about how important a person he was in the culinary world, but very, very interesting stuff that I would have had to find out anyway. Coming from his perspective, he's a pretty good author. Again, he thought we were working on a book project, so he thought he was going to be this co-author, and so he's pretty articulate. And so anyway, after 9 months, I then asked him, listen, I need to have information. I said the publisher wants to know information that you claim to not remember. And that's basically the crux of the case as well, that he had butchered this person, taken hours to do it, apparently according to the pathologist at trial, that it was carefully reassembled as some ghoulish, again, murder horror spectacle for the police to discover. This person gave me that information starting after 9 months and up to about 1 year correspondence, until that correspondence ended in about February of 2005.
Okay. Now, you asked Sydney, one of the first questions you asked him was if he had ever blacked out from alcohol and done something regrettable. His answer was no. Now, his whole alibi is based off of him blacking out, not remembering what he's done. Is that one of the first signs that registered to you? Like right away he's lying to you already, for one, and he's counteracting basically his alibi.
The thing is, this is absurd anyway. This is what I tried to point out, and again, I think the American audience gets it a little bit more. I think they're a little bit more attuned to legal issues, at least the audience that I have, and some people that really do read a lot of true crime get over an extended period of time, a really good legal education of sorts. So I think the idea that I'm drunk and I can't remember, it doesn't even apply in America. It would be a mitigating factor in sentencing, but it wouldn't be enough to diminish intent to kill. And so that's what we have in this. I wanted to point out, again, for the audience, which I think is mostly American and international audience for that book, is that this is absurd that you would have such an incredible, like I said, 3 hours of precision, of surgical precision done, an equivalent of an autopsy, a careful autopsy, from somebody that seemed to be experienced, according to the pathologist, in this type of dismemberment and dissection and careful disarticulation of limbs. And then later just like I said, the ghoulish recreation of the washed body parts. And what's even more unique and horrifying is that he displayed this body, posed it for maximum shock value by slicing open the chest cavity and removing all of the victim's internal organs, and then going somewhere outside the radius of the hotel, in a certain radius that the police later searched, and disposed of those organs. So this is the kind of thing that we have just initially, before I even became involved, the absurdity of someone's claiming that they couldn't remember doing an autopsy, removal of organs, and then disposal of them somewhere miles away.
Yeah, that's... The fact that somebody would think that anybody would believe that is outrageous. And I also find it amazing that he would think that writing you what he wrote you, that you wouldn't report him.
Well, like I said, I think he's an intelligent person, he's an articulate person, but I don't know if he isn't deluded, and I don't know how much he suffers from naivety, but the instructions were that he wanted this information that he imparted to me. And this was early on, he had said, but the information that he imparted to me, he wanted it to be published, but after the trial, so that he could get a diminished sentence, which he believed would be manslaughter, which he would be available under this, I'm drunk and I can't remember, would then diminish the intent to kill, which would then would qualify as manslaughter. So he knew that. So he wanted the information to be published. He wanted to get a 10-year sentence, which means he'd be out in 5, 6, or 7 with the current Canadian laws. And then he would be famous. He would make money from the sale of a book. He would have his fame as this one-off, incredible, beyond Jack the Ripper killer, and yet have all of the fame and infamy that he desired his entire life, while insinuating, and hinting that he was actually a vicious, brutal serial killer in the ilk of Jeffrey Dahmer, Dennis Nielsen, and John Wayne Gacy.
Well, let's talk about the serial killer subject. I mean, there were other murders in BC and Alberta, right? That they said...
The only information I have is because there's such scant information in Canada, is information from him, is that there were murders in Alberta, there was murders in British Columbia. He says that were very, very similar to these murders that the murder occurred in Winnipeg. So if you look at it at the face value, there can't be other murders like the one in Winnipeg that do not show up in any media. That would be impossible. But as I say, if he is a huge fan of Jeffrey Dahmer, who destroyed his bodies completely, knew how to destroy of his victims entirely, and has the same MO in terms of getting people that maybe people won't even report missing, incredibly, or will be less likely to look for them. And when you destroy them completely, there really isn't any investigation. So that's where Sidney was in that regard.
Okay. Now, his background, he says he was abused when he was young by his brother and his mother and his music teacher. Did we find out, was any of that actually true? Was he making that stuff up? Because it seemed like he said a lot of outlandish things, like saying that he wanted to be eaten by an East Indian man, or...
Well, the thing is, there's two separate things. I think the most important thing is, and this is what I say in the book, but I put more of a show and not tell, but I would say if I wanted to tell I would say this, that it's irresponsible or beyond irresponsible, and should never be allowed. It should never be allowed to say unsubstantiated claims against his adopted mother, the woman that was good enough to take this foster child, then adopted this child, took him into their family as their own child, and to say this now that this woman is deceased, so she cannot defend herself, to say in an open court that his lawyer allowing that information and the prosecution allowing that information, that again is defamatory and unnecessary and unsubstantiated, which just could be a big bald-faced lie. As you notice with Sidney, things about myself, the cellmate, the prosecutor, his adopted parents, his adopted siblings, I mean, everyone seems to have damaged and personally hurt Sidney Tierhus, and he has something derogatory to say about everybody. And there are lots of numerous examples of lies from Sidney Tierhus. If you were to read everything carefully, direct examination to cross-examination, you will see that Sidney is a notorious liar, along with his notoriously lying lawyer.
We're going to talk about him because reading your book and listening to his lawyer say things like the truth doesn't matter.
Well, he's correct. He's more honest than your average lawyer in that they really don't. The justice system does not care about the act. Well, it doesn't matter about care. It is not obligated to look for the truth. Justice is different. It's not about innocence. It's not guilty doesn't mean innocence necessarily. When this lawyer tells you this is the way it works, one of the most experienced murder trial lawyer in the English-speaking world, you can know that he was trained. Other lawyers work the same way. But not everybody defends the most heinous killers like this person. But he tells the truth. That's what I got him, to tell the truth. Incredibly, this was an education for me at that time. I was quite naive at that time too. The justice system doesn't mean it's about the truth. And the lawyer, apparently, even though the golden rule, the foundation of the judicial system is he's not to lie for his client, nor have his client lie on the stand, I think I prove with this book, most importantly, if anything else, the truth about that. That no, in fact, the lawyer will lie, will know it's a lie, will present lies, and will lie on his client's behalf and present his client to lie on the stand. And this is exactly what happened in this book. And I think I provide the evidence. This lawyer apparently has read this book where I call him a liar. And there's been no repercussions.
Well, the truth is the truth, Dan. And if you know it, there's not much you can argue about it.
Well, it depends where it comes out. You can look at the media. If you look at the CTV representation of what happened on that trial, and if you look at the Winnipeg Free Press, and you look at the Winnipeg Sun, and I would say in totality, there's a general non-understanding and ignorance of what happened in that trial, unless, again, it's not to promote this book so much as you can't get the story unless you read 400 pages about the story.
Absolutely.
The story is complex. It's too easy to dismiss because, again, this isn't glamorous. Homosexuals, Aboriginal, possibly drunk. Wow, way down on the scale of people, the media especially, interest.
Yeah.
Because they think the people don't care. And so this story gets ignored unless a book like this comes out. But imagine if I didn't get involved with this and Sidney wasn't able to go to a journalist like myself that didn't have restrictions or limitations or reservations, wanted to recognize this as a opportunity to tell a big, broader story. What if I wasn't there? What if he didn't have the opportunity in this chance meeting with this cellmate? Even though I was in a position, I would not have thought to contact him and do this book project unless this fateful turn of events occurred. So what would have happened? What we would have known about this? You wouldn't even heard about it. No one would have heard about this.
It just would have been swept under the rug.
Exactly.
And he probably would have got a manslaughter charge.
Sure looks like it. You see the prediction from a former Crown attorney from Thunder Bay and other people as well, in that it sure would certainly qualify. And then when you read everything, I was reading today the judge's address to the jury. Confusing. Very, very confusing. Even the pathologist, I put the entire pathologist, basically the basic transcript, testimony, and it is long, but people will see that the pathologist at first supports the idea for the prosecution and then oddly supports almost the case for the defense. And it can't be both. It cannot be both. So it's confusing. And it's confusing, and that's, I think, where you get this reasonable doubt and then a lower sentence, and then, you know, a second-degree murder. This Sidney Tierhuis could have got 10 years before he was eligible for parole. So in 10 years, he could have been eligible for parole. That's under second-degree murder. The manslaughter, as I say in the book, because of that time, the provision was 2 for 1 time, double time credit for pretrial custody. So no matter if he delayed the trial, which he did, so that it was 5.5 years after the crime, that would count for 11 years towards a manslaughter sentence, which was typically 10. So he would have done 5.5, 6 years and walked the streets. And when you read what he did and how much he enjoyed it, and you read any portion of this book, any portion of the 2 chapters have the explicit warnings.
Yes, those chapters, those chapters actually, I had to stop more than once while reading them because the graphic details, and to know that something like this actually happened is, it can make you emotional in a way, because to know somebody could do what he did to another human body is...
Well, the thing is that I may be interested in serial killers now. I'm interested in reading about it, but I'm interested in it for a different reason. And he's interested in it for a different reason. He's interested in these stories because he admires these people. I guess he identifies with Dennis Nielsen, the chef, the lonely chef in England, where he'd invite men over, and then when they wanted to leave, he'd bonk them over the head and then hang around with them and have sex with them until they were completely rotten. Then he would dispose of them in the sewage system. And that's how he got caught. So not only does he admire these people and identifies with them, but he also learns from them. And then Jeffrey Dahmer, another great example. What he admires too is the status these people have now. And so somewhere along the line, and I do the podcast every week now for 7 years, something gets mixed up in the wiring of these people, that murder and sex and gratification and your ego and self-esteem are all twisted up, and these people admire the kinds of people that we are horrified by.
Oh, man. Something I want to know is, what would you classify Sidney as? Would you classify him as a highly organized psychopath?
Sometimes, as you can see, some of these things are a little bit outdated in terms of strict classification, or the classifications are simply to just for a little more general purpose. Sidney Tierhuis is a little bit more complex in that this is pretty organized when you do an autopsy. When you do a figure-8 pattern, a symmetrical pattern on his chest. When you disarticulate the elbows like a surgeon, like a coroner would, like a pathologist would. not somebody that works in the culinary industry. That's what the pathologist testified. That's what the media doesn't see. That's what I can't put a big red spotlight on. Listen, check this out. But if somebody were more legal minded, they would look at this and see that, it wasn't brought up, it wasn't raised, it wasn't highlighted by the judge or the prosecution. Again, they aimed at other things that seemed almost ridiculous to me. But these important, crucial things were that the pathologist, through the letters, said, yes, everything that Sidney Tierhus said is consistent with what actually would happen, blowing up the lungs, or the graphic descriptions of the things that he did as he basically did this autopsy. Basically what he did. But all that proves is that in this particular case, in this murder case in Canada, because he already agreed that he did murder the person, but he just couldn't remember, is that now that he could remember. My letters, the 1 year of correspondence, and my testimony as a star witness only prove that yes, he did remember, because if he was doing this, then that's all this was. Instead of recognizing a lot more of what this was. In that, just like I thought, it took me a while to think about this, but they dismissed the jury not for the reasons that they normally would in a serious case, especially a murder case. And that's why this is called the Shall We Dance Murder too. What is Susan Sarandon's jury got to do with this? And why is the jury just not the motive for this murder, but other murders?
You know, something I found interesting was the figure eight pattern. Now, I looked up the significance of the figure eight, and a figure eight turned sideways stands for infinity. Now, I find it that Sidney, wanting to be a star in his own right, maybe this was his own sick little joke, saying, now I'll go on forever. You'll know me forever because of this.
Well, that's what he wanted to do. That's why the jewelry is important. Sidney Tierhus, as you see in the book, he's a self-avowed big celebrity fan, including Susan Sarandon. He mentions movies that Susan Sarandon stars in. So when this movie was in Winnipeg, as I point out, the Ted Matulka Dance Center was next door to the Woodbine where Robin Green met Sidney Tierhus on that fateful day on July 1st. But for 2 weeks before that, Richard Gere was taking private ballroom dancing lessons right next door, 2 feet away. So that meant there was a limo out in front and security out front, which meant you could but not notice it. Sidney lived about 50, maybe 75 yards away in this broken down hotel called the Royal Albert Hotel. Every newspaper, especially the rags, especially the tabloids, the media, this was a big deal because Susan Sarandon, Jennifer Lopez was starring in the movie as well, Richard Gere. This was the follow-up to Chicago, so this was a big thing. So when he knew, by the late afternoon, when he realized that this jewelry came from the set of the Shall We Dance movie, I think what he hatched very quickly was a plan to kill his victim, like he had killed other victims that nobody would notice for a while or care in the end.
Sorry, go ahead.
And he thought, if I have that jewelry found at the crime scene, that'll attain the fame that I want, like the heroes of serial killers that I know. He had when you talked about Vancouver, you talked about Alberta, my idea is this. If you lived in Winnipeg, which has got to be one of the toughest places to be a homosexual or anybody different, especially homosexual, and you thought your adopted family did you wrong or just didn't understand you, I could see people thinking it very freeing to be a chef out in Vancouver. He had visited out there with his family. He liked it out there. Who wouldn't? So he went out to Vancouver, became a chef. That was his dream. Heroin was out there. People like him, the S&M scene, the big city. He loved it. So why move to Alberta, which is almost like the redneck opposite of Vancouver? He's a chef. He doesn't save a lot of money. He's a junkie. Why is he going to Alberta? Then he gets treatment in Alberta for 6 months, and then he leaves Alberta. And then he comes to Ontario, and then he's finally back in the city that he is born in, enacts revenge on his adopted family on July 2nd, wants to get famous with this jewelry at the crime scene of a most gruesome crime that not even Jack the Ripper committed. He's gonna get it all. And then he conducts interviews, and then later he just looks for somebody to... The last bit of the puzzle is me. A person that wants to write a book, and this is a person that wants to tell you about the most incredible story.
You could really sense early on in the book his craving for celebrity or attention.
Well, that was easy to see. I mean, you wouldn't have to read too many true crime books or have to be too intuitive to really see that. So I played upon that as well. I mean, obviously, I could see that this person was naive to a certain degree. Maybe not naive, delusional. Somewhat delusional.
When he sent you these letters, Dan, like, what was going through your mind when you open this envelope and he just starts describing all of the stuff that he did to this person?
Well, see, it was gradual. It was 9 months, like I'd said before. I said, listen, I appreciate all this stuff about your family and everything else, but I was sick of hearing this exaggeration and his self-importance. And really, all along, I thought that I could somehow, I'm not certain why, but I knew that I could get him to admit that he certainly did remember, and I was getting sort of little bits and pieces that seemed to intimate that, well, he certainly did, and he was certainly writing a little bit about that, I would say. So I said, listen, the publisher needs to know details about the things that you say you can't remember, the night in question. And so then it just seemed like a flood. It seemed like that just freed him to tell someone what he did, but not only what he did in the most graphic and complete detail, but also how much he enjoyed it. His anticipation of the dismemberment, sharpening up his culinary tools with his blade, sharpening blade. And then later, the post-murder activities and his enjoyment of his work of art, as he called it, the man as a human trophy, and the body as a human trophy, and the defiling of this man, and how much he enjoyed that, and what an extraordinary, exhilarating event for him. So, what was it like? It was like nothing I've ever... pardon me. It was like nothing I've ever experienced, obviously. And just luckily, I had a couple close friends and a couple family members that I could share this stuff, this horror with. And at the same time, I was getting more and more confident that this was going to be definitely a successful book, since I could see the importance of him giving me this information. I knew it wasn't just interesting information for a book. I actually knew that I was gaining crucial evidence in a murder trial that was ongoing.
Now, reading what he wrote you and knowing that there could be a potential outcome of manslaughter, is that really what made you think, now I absolutely have to give this information, or there's a chance that he's going to get out and come looking for me?
Well, I mean, the thing is that I always would have came forward with evidence. I mean, I don't think I'm a journalist first. I think I'm more of a citizen first, because I don't know if as a journalist, that I would suppress this information. Very much like a lawyer gets a confession from a killer, he will suppress it. That's what a lawyer will do. If a killer gave me a confession. I don't care who it was, no matter what relationship as a journalist and feature person or interviewee, it would make no difference. I would report a crime. I mean, there's no ethics on earth that I could think that I would protect somebody from the law itself.
For sure.
So in this case, with my background anyway, People for Justice, and I just knew that I had this evidence. And at that same time, I was getting advice from legal people, a law professor, and also a former Crown attorney, and a couple journalists as well. The journalist said, don't contact them till after the preliminary, just before the trial. And the legal professional said, no, you have evidence, you need to approach the Crown attorney.
Absolutely. I want to know, Dan, do you have any other books in the works right now?
Right now, I've been here in Thunder Bay, relocated from Winnipeg a little over a year ago, and there's a cold case. A young man was just turned 17, Scott Dove, in Thunder Bay, Ontario, and there isn't much information officially. As they say, it's an open case, so nobody can get any information, including the parents. But this person was abducted on Halloween. He was a high school student living at home with his parents. He was a competitive swimmer, straight kid, just had a car. His parents had given him some money to get, and was going to high school on Halloween and disappeared. And he was involved in some marijuana and such in a very, very minor role. This is 1983. We're talking about a couple ounces of marijuana, and he disappeared. I don't think there was speculation about the marijuana at that point, but in a month, though, he was discovered by a couple people walking a dog in a rural area. And again, the details are shaky or not so clear on exactly how he was found, but he was certainly found stabbed to death, at least. But there were rumors, and in a city of 100,000, it's hard to keep a secret, and it was rumors of at least mutilation in terms of sort of a message. And then came, after the discovery of the body, was reports that somehow he was involved in some nefarious gang that enacted revenge on him for either being a rat, a tattletale, or not paying his bill, or something absurd like that. And even at my certain age, I knew that was ridiculous. So.
Well, that's the first thing that came to my mind when you brought up a couple ounces of marijuana, and being stabbed made me think right away, a drug dealer or drug deal gone wrong, But then you say mutilation, and that makes me think of something different.
Yeah, the thing is, I've worked on this case for now a year, and I'm come close to basically wrapping it up. This case has been cold for 33 years, and the unique part of this case is, as well, is that instead of continuing with a murder investigation, they had a suspect, again, based on the marijuana and the revenge, or at least the marijuana involvement, and named somebody publicly, but had, instead of an ongoing investigation, the father asked for an inquest, and an inquest was called, which is usually something that would happen after a workplace death. So an inappropriate, I don't know, we'll say, for lack of a better word, device, the wrong legal action was taken. Nothing happened except to name a suspect, and that's where the case stayed. Despite advances in DNA collection, there was a car that was left. His car was stolen, and he was found later. So despite advances in DNA, despite the case being reopened about 6 or 7 years ago, this case is very, very, very cold. It's touched the entire community, but as I found out, just scratching the surface, as I thought when I was 24, when I heard about this, just ridiculous that anyone could be killed over a small amount of marijuana, never mind a huge amount of marijuana at 7 17 years of age living at home. So I knew there was more to the story, and there certainly is. So I think I'll have that published in some form. I think I may want to try to really do something with the audiobook, try to do something different with the audiobook and write this book and so that it really, well, actually narrate a book that would be more suited for as an audiobook. So I think that's what I'm going to try to do in this near future, in the next year, actually. So I think that's what I'm up to.
Well, I look forward to it because after reading Trophy Kill, you know, your journalism, the work you put into this is outstanding.
Thank you.
And I particularly liked your use of Robert Ressler. When you were asking him, the two questions you asked him really played into how you could approach Sydney and ask him certain questions.
Yeah, it's a shame I didn't get to get to interview Robert Ressler during this. It would have been really invaluable. And at the time, I got to say, at that time, it was previous to this project, and I really didn't know who Robert Ressler was and the magnitude of the work that he had done. And I had not read or very little of his work, so I wasn't as prepared for the interview as I would have liked. Afterwards, of course, I discovered all of Robert Ressler's work and his work with John Douglas, and so yeah, it was great to be able to speak to him, even if it was a fairly short interview.
Yeah, I particularly enjoyed that. I just want to let everybody know that Dan hosts True Murder, a podcast you can find on iTunes, and it's a great show. It's very, very rare that I miss an episode. So definitely check that out. And could you let everybody know where they could find Trophy Kill, Dan?
Trophy Kill is, like everywhere else, you can get it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. It is in ebook form and it is in paperback form, but it's not in audible form. So you can get that anywhere. You could get it from the publisher Prohypticon in Toronto, but I would recommend Amazon, just certainly because the price... It's a little bit pricey, the book, but it's much cheaper at Amazon than anywhere else. So that's where I would get the book, the paperback, or the ebook, which is even more reasonably priced than the paperback.
And I definitely urge anybody that is into true crime whatsoever, please get this book because you won't be disappointed. I want to thank you for coming on the show today, Dan. I really appreciate you taking the time to do that.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for those great questions, and it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Take care.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Tune in next week for my guest, Proof Rock Shadowrunner, rapper, DJ, and very intelligent human being. We talk about race, we talk about music, we talk about U.S. politics, so don't miss out on that one because it's a really fun interview. Make sure to go to Facebook and like the page, Mopping the Floor with Chris Norman. You can follow me on Twitter, @MoppingTheFloor, and make sure to subscribe on iTunes and subscribe on YouTube. Thanks a lot, guys. I'll see you next week.